Barry Silverberg, Director of the Center for Nonprofit Studies at Austin Community College, and welcome to Civil Society, where we explore issues affecting our communal well-being through a nonprofit lens. We're a proud partner of Austin Community College TV, but given COVID-19, we're going virtual for our fourth season. Our center is fully committed to being an anti-racist organization, to accelerating our personal learning journeys, confronting our biases and blind spots, and creating opportunities for others to do the same. This episode is part of our series on the Hispanic Latinx experience in Austin. In January, we'll explore the Asian Pacific Islander American and then the Native American Indigenous peoples' experiences in Austin. You can access recordings of earlier episodes and sign up for future programs at nonprofitaustin.org/civil society. We recently completed our 9-part series on the Black experience in Austin. I'm thrilled that my guest today is Martha Cotera, a nationally recognized feminist, historian, independent scholar, and since 1974, a business owner, publisher, and archivist consultant at UT's noted Benson Latin American collection. She's the author of groundbreaking feminist texts, including Goddess and Women, History and Heritage of Chicanas in the United States, in the US, The Chicana Feminist, and Multicultural Women's Sourcebook. Her writings also include more than 100 other books, essays, and articles on archives, history, and civil rights issues. To put it briefly, she's a very busy lady. In her oral history at the Latina History Project at Southwestern University, which I really enjoyed listening to, she speaks about playing amidst Anasazi ruins in Casa Grande, Chihuahua, Mexico, and growing up with a strong consciousness of her indigenous roots and the values of her ancestors. Her upbringing was infused with a strong dose of progressive politics because her grandparents were very involved in Mexican politics. Emigrating to El Paso in 1946, she encountered racist policies in both elementary school and high school. After marrying Juan Cotera, she moved to Austin in 1963 so Juan could continue his education in architecture at the University of Texas. Although they encountered what she described as extreme racism in Austin, they were determined to stay and help transform the city. Martha was hired as director of documents at the Texas State Library in Austin. Later in 1968, she became director of Southwest Educational Development and was put in charge of 28 libraries across the state of Texas. Later, she and Juan were involved in numerous community ventures, including to help found Jacinto Trevino College as a college for Mexican Americans to prepare teachers for bilingual, bicultural education programs. Involved in the farm workers movement, Martha and her husband helped found and structure the Raza Unida Party, a third political party centered on Chicano nationalism. Eventually, she and other women active in the party began to feel marginalized by the male leadership of the movement, so they established a women's caucus within the party. Martha is a founding member of over 23 local, state, and national organizations advocating for women and families. She's the recipient of numerous national, state, and local awards for scholarship, leadership, and civic activism. She's been influential in helping found or serving as a charter member of organizations that are now Austin landmarks, including the Rape Crisis Center and Center for Battered Women, known as Safe Place, the Austin Lyric Opera, the Greater Austin Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, the Blanton Museum, the Mexicart Museum, the Center for Mexican American Studies at UT, and the Texas Center for Educational Policy at UT. She remains an active volunteer at the MSS Barrientos Mexican American Cultural Center, for which she spearheaded construction of the center and continues to be involved there as a volunteer. She's currently an independent translator and community consultant and remains active in local politics and community initiatives. Martha, I'm exhausted by just reading your credentials, okay? I've looked forward to chatting with you since I started reading about your background. It's absolutely fascinating. Yours is a life really well lived, a life that's been fully engaged in healing our world and fighting for social justice while still being true to your own roots. And I think that is extremely admirable. So I'm honored that you join us, and I'm looking forward to you sharing your wisdom with us. So let's start by talking about Martha Katera, the activist. So you grew up amidst the Anasazi ruins and absorbing the wisdom of your ancestors. Number one, just for context, who are the Anasazis, and what was your life like as a child in Chihuahua, Mexico?
Well, the Anasazi date, or say in our area in Casas Grandes, from maybe the 11th century, but they're recognized more about the 13th century. And it's part of a stream of it's a huge culture that expands Arizona, New Mexico, and Chihuahua. And that's what binds us. There are Casas Grandes in New Mexico, Casas Grandes in Arizona, and then Casas Grandes in Chihuahua. The best they're known for is their architecture, which is Pueblo architecture. So if you go to the ruins where I grew up, they weren't discovered yet. It was so funny when UT discovered them, because I shared this with my good friend Bobby. I need to give a shout out to my good friend Bobby. She knows all this history. I don't know what you're doing here, Bobby, but thank you for being in my corner today, a fellow traveler here in Austin. But anyway, they're known for their aesthetic. They're known for their architecture. And also in my family's lifetime, they're known for carrying the history of resistance against empires, because they resisted the Aztec Empire. And so when we found the little clay coins in the mounds, when it rained, the coins would be, and the necklaces would be uncovered, and of course we would sneak them out of the mounds and take them to our play areas to put on our dolls. And my grandmother would make us take them back and hide them, and so if you can imagine, put them back in the mounds, because they belong to our ancestors and we were not to take them away. But the biggest discovery to me, and I don't know if it's true or not, of course, because this is grandparent talk, was the little ceramic coins that we found, ceramic cylinder items. They said were called Moctezumas, and they said that was some kind of receipt for the tribute that you paid to the Aztecs. So today in Austin, like when at the MAC they want to do this thing about, oh, Aztec, everything Aztec is beautiful. I like pull out my hair and say, don't you know that half of the nation resisted the Aztec Empire and that they were colonizers in a lot of our areas? In my area, they would accept it as merchants, and they were good traders. So, we would trade and I guess pay tribute, and have the little Moctezumas as receipts. Apparently, that's what my grandmother said. Anyway, I grew up with in that kind of resistance mode. So I guess, and I always say that that Mexicanos and people throughout the Americas, have always been in resistance mode since, in Peru it was the Incas, and then it was the Aztecs in Mexico. In Central America, they governed there too. And so when the Europeans came, I think we were ready to continue the resistance.
So how has, well, some extent you just answered it, but to expand on, how has knowing your history and being comfortable with your history and yourself and your culture,
well,
your life's course?
Yes, sir. Those of us that are lucky enough to grow up close to our parents and grandparents, can learn a lot, because, like in my case, with my mom, I can learn everything that happened from the 1919. For example, I know that she was born during the Spanish flu, and that's why they moved to a rural area, to the farm, to the family farms, so that so the family would not be affected. I know from my grandparents my history knowledge goes way back through my grandmother, because she's native of the area where I was born, and my grandfather, who was born in another area, but whose family was given a land grant in Texas. And then in 1848, they decided to go back to Mexico. And of course, they landed in Mexico, and within 20 years, there was a terrible, terrible war. So I learned about the French invasion and what happened, and what the family suffered as refugees. He had to go to Chihuahua, literally walked to Chihuahua with his parents, and that's where he met my grandmother. So you learn this history. But I think that along with the history, it's not just history, because people will talk about values. You know, people will talk about why they reacted, why they supported the Mexican Revolution, because it meant separation of church and state, because it meant communal land properties were protected, because it meant greater equality for the indigenous and Mexicano community, and you know, more distribution of income in an equitable way. You learn these values as you learn family history. And I think that's just really important, because this never goes away.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about the Chicano struggle for human rights and human and civil rights. I know this is sort of a very broad question, but we're limited in time, obviously. But what do you believe are the most important things that both Hispanics and Anglos ought to know about that struggle?
Well, I think that for most of us, and like I said, I'm lucky, but all of us share that family history. So the Chicano movement is an episode or part of a stream of resistance that most of us, you know, date back to pre-Hispanic times and to definitely colonial times, you know. So it's a stream of resistance. The indigenous community, the native Mexican American community in Mexico and in Texas and in the rest of the US, you know, has always been on this track. So the movement was just kind of like a massive stop, you know, where there was a confluence of other movements, and it was very exciting to join, you know, to add our value to the movements that were going on at the same time. But it was definitely for us, as for the African American communities and for women, a movement of liberation, a movement that promoted above all, you know, values of liberation, values of humanity, recognizing, very similar to the Black Lives Matter movement, you know, recognizing the humanity in all of us, and then demanding that we be fully recognized as citizens. So basically, that's the essence of the movement: a movement for liberation, a movement to acquire full citizenship. And like I said, we made a lot of strides, but we're still a long ways from full citizenship for most of the people in the US, not just for Mexicanos, but for most of the people, including poor people, you know,
Absolutely.
because poor people do not have full citizenship.
Superb. When you published your book, Women, Goddess and Women, The History and Heritage of Chicana in the U.S. in 1976, it generated a great deal of interest among Chicana students and the women's movement. What was it about this book that, and whatever you presented in the book, that caused such a stir and helped spur more thinking and involvement?
Well, I think like a lot of feminist texts in 1970, 68, 70 era, it was a curtain raiser, you know. Being a librarian and an archivist, what I wanted to do, and not an elegant text, is like, ooh, every time I read back on it, I meant it as an outline. I meant it as a, you know, period piece where people could lift the curtain a little bit and see, you know, representative women So it was by no means a deep, 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 deep study, but representative women that were acting in the moment, but that came from a historical base, and then we're moving toward a future, positive future for other women. So that my idea was that teachers, scholars, students could focus on a piece. For example, Elizabeth Salas focused on the soldaderas, the women that worked that fought in the revolution, Mexico's revolution, on both sides of the border, and did a wonderful, 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 wonderful piece. And other people have too. Other people have focused on Our Lady of Guadalupe and have done amazing studies. And so other women that were contemporaries, Ana Nieto Gomez, Adela Sosa, I mean, I can name, so many women, scholars, and activists that wrote pieces, but we were all writing kind of piecemeal. And I thought, okay, I'm a librarian. I can put this information together in something like 10 months. I put down what is basically just an outline piece, but it's an outline piece that has the information, references, but it also has kind of pointers, for example, reimagining Our Lady of Guadalupe for what she is, and that she is the continuation of the goddess creator of Mexico. So there's a reason why women will forever, venerate the Virgin, because she represents the Mexicana, but also the goddess tradition, the tradition that women brought with them when they became part of the colonial system, And so I did things like that. So we did La Llorona. I don't know if I remember that did La Llorona, but I did other women that La Malinche, Doña Marina, the liaison person and interpreter for the Spanish and the Native communities during the conquest. And I, along with other women, but in my book, we recovered her, we reimagined her position, and we said, no, we are not again going to be chastised for having been raped, basically, during the conquest, because no woman has to be raped. She just does the best she can to survive. And it's really wonderful that even today, not too long ago, Denise Hernandez produced la, ¿cómo se llama? La Chingada. I forget what, I don't know what she, I can't remember the film now, but it was an essay, a series of interviews with young women about give me, okay, oh, La Chingona, give me your definition of Chingona. And it was right on, despite the fact that we haven't had women's studies in the high schools and ethnic studies. But anyway, so it was a curtain raiser, but the thing about the reason why we wrote it, or we all wrote feminist text at that time, was because the men in the movement thought that liberation meant liberation for men. And I think a lot of men still feel that way, that they mean, liberation is for men only because they're the only humans, and that the rest of us, had to do the dishes. And the other thing that they thought is that our culture, we realized that they thought our culture was actually only raising children and doing dishes, and that it did not go beyond logistics, that's all that women were good for, like a cow or like a horse, logistics, they were good there for, to make sure the men stayed alive, I guess. And the other thing that made us write texts like this at that time was that if women's presence as spokespeople and as leaders or prominent followers or whatever it is, if their participation was not enabled in a real way, then the values that we wanted to promote, the policies that we wanted to promote, were not at the table. And so when I say that the men were having all the fun, I mean it. They thought that the movement was all about, making speeches and drinking and having fun and going after all the women they could go. And Bobby will back me up on this. And so it was very important to say, no, women need to participate because we are also after liberation and because our values and our policy needs and issues need to be at the table. So we had to do it.
So in the article about you in Wikipedia, okay, and I think you're the first person I've talked to who actually has an article in Wikipedia, so congratulations. It says that you wrote the book as a response to rampant misogyny within the Chicano nationalist and political movements. I think you've just described how it manifested itself. In other interviews that I read, you talked about how the guys, quote, the guys did a lot of talking and fun stuff, like you're saying right now. So what did you and your colleagues do to change that? What did you do to, as you said, get a seat at the table and to move things along in what you believe was the right direction?
Well, what we did is we did a lot of writing, and then we used the same text as Consciousness Racing. So we had caucuses. We had a caucus within the party, and then we had a broader caucus of political activists within the community and the movement as a whole. And then we had a caucus, and we were founders of the National Women's Political Caucus and the Texas Women's Political Caucus, because we wanted to, bring the issues, bring policy issues. Rosie Castro has said it beautifully. She says, we were not looking for chingon leadership for ourselves. We were looking for meaningful participation for ourselves. We didn't care who led as long as our issues were at the table. So that was the important thing. And the issues were not getting at the table if women did not participate in a meaningful ways. And so we trained community. We went and had meetings all over the state with community women. We realized that community women felt uncomfortable in the public sphere, and that's understandable. We had to convince women that it'd be fine to just be powerful at home and at church if the children stayed at home and at church, but their children were out in the community, getting killed, and being discriminated. And so they had to be out there in the public sphere. And within a year, we had 8 women candidates in Crystal City under the Raza Unida party. And in fact, our Raza Unida candidate, Lieutenant Governor Alma, was just barely met the minimum age to participate. And so we were very, very successful in convincing women that the public sphere was also their responsibility, and I think it has remained that way. It has remained that way. I am so happy. That is one of the big gains that I think the Chicano movement had, is to bring women in, Latinas, into the public sphere.
Picking up on that, how does the struggles and the movement in the days you're just talking about compared to what's going on today?
Oh, I think I just said it. I don't know how. Well, I do know how this continued to be at the forefront, but I think that because the women in the movement did not, go back home, so to speak, but that the great majority of us remained involved. In fact, here in Austin, we established the Mexican American Business and Professional Women that included, Republican, Democrats, and Raza Unida women, included LGBTQ women, because it is true that in a lot of times they didn't feel comfortable in the movement. And through this organization, we continued movement activities. I established a nonprofit, Chicana Research and Learning Center, to push for women's studies at UT, Latina studies at UT, and it happened. We pushed to develop ethnic studies at UT, and it happened. So the movement never stopped. And fortunately, the women in the movement never stopped. I can name, Margaret Gomez, Commissioner Gomez, activist, Bobby, here with us, activist and founder of institutions in San Marcos and in Austin. And so we continued community building. You know, the movement never stopped for women.
All right, I want to leave some of those kinds of questions to our audience. So let me move to another area, sort of self-reflection, okay? So I mean this as a compliment. You don't seem like a patient person, okay? You seem like you want to get results, all right? So how do you deal with, as a leader, how do you deal with the frustrations of the glacial pace of change?
Well, the way I deal with it is I I I look back in a very positive way. I look back and people complain to me. My granddaughter sometimes complains, and I say, hey, when I set up my business, I couldn't even get a phone for my business. My husband had to go sign, which he did just gleefully. I mean, I've never seen him so happy. I had signed the phone checks for 20 years and I could not get a phone line on my own. And so we did something about that. We did something about women's credit. We did something about the ERA. We're still struggling for the ERA. We did something to make things happen. And so women are not in the same place. Men of color are not in the same place. And so I look back, the way I deal with frustrations is I look back and I say, look at all we did. I mean, we have a multi-million-dollar Mexican-American Cultural Center. We have Mexicarte Museum. We have institutions, our institutions in our community, compared to the past in communities of color, are first rate, including libraries. When I was struggling as a library commissioner, Ida Mae Kirk and I had to switch vacation, could not go on vacation at the same time because they closed the Black library or they closed our library. And so none of that is happening because we made policy a very important part, and voting a very important part of the communities of color agenda. So I look back, I deal with my frustrations by looking back and saying, look at what the road that we have traveled and look at the wonderful things we have achieved. And if we achieve this much, you know, in the past, we can certainly keep moving and keep building and keep achieving.
So looking back, but also looking forward, okay? Knowing what you know today, what would you say to that little girl playing in the Asahi ruins? Okay, that she ought to know for her to have the greatest life possible?
Well, that was a very difficult question because I made some decisions that were frankly kind of stupid in my own personal, professional trajectory. I very often fall in love with the notion of something that I want to do. Like I fell in love, I helped set up the Mexican American Library Project at UT, an archival project, and I fell in love with the idea of being the queen of, you know, Mexican American Library projects all over the nation and having the very best, amazing, you know, archive. Well, that was not to be because I could not be hired. Sometimes you lose things because you're gaining other things. So I could not be hired because I was too radical in my politics with Raza Unida Party. I had been a candidate for State Board of Education, and I was very prominent in the party. And so they frankly told me, there's no way that they're going to approve your appointment. And stupid me, I accepted a 10-hour-a-week appointment that meant that I had to find other ways of earning a living. And so I didn't do as good a job as I could have done there because I couldn't afford to spend, you know, 80 hours a week on it. And I did not become the queen of, you know, archives like I wanted to be. The goddess of information, basically, is what I wanted to be. And I didn't become that. And I also did not take the time and effort to get a PhD, and I should have done that because I would have been a very happy, you know, teacher, I think, professor in higher education. However, I have a daughter that did that. So my daughter's going to come teach at UT this coming January, and I am very happy. And she's an amazing feminist scholar, you know, and has a wonderful website called Chicana por mi Raza that compiles histories like mine from throughout the nation and puts them up there. This is what I wanted to do. And it's okay. I mean, I'm okay with it, but I still want it to be Goddess of Information. Didn't
I
do
think
it.
you've done pretty well despite that. So, I asked you before we got on the show about lessons learned, and you said you don't learn lessons well. I don't agree with that, but that's besides the point. So, what lessons have you learned? What is it that you have told your daughter, told your granddaughter? What would you like to tell the younger folks today that they ought to keep in mind as they engage in resistance and in civil struggles in trying to change the world?
Well, I think one of the hardest lessons for that's been hard for me to learn is I'm very judgmental about people, and I have very high standards, and I get very easily annoyed, and so I have not always delegated very wisely, or not delegated at all, and that's not good. But then I really, to tell you the truth, I do not consider myself a leader. I hate that word. I really, really do, because I think that people ought to just take on projects and do them, and it's all situational, because you may not be the best person to take a particular project, and let somebody else do it. I'm very good at doing that, but I'm not as good, and I have to remind myself time and time and time again every day to trust young people more, and whenever I start thinking, oh my gosh, what are they thinking, and who do they think they are? They're only like 22, and then or 24 or whatever. Then I remember that my mentors in El Paso, Elizabeth Kelly and Marcel Hamer, trusted me enough to say, go after running a department. And I started working when I was 18. And when I was 19, and when I was 20, they said, go run a department. And I did. I actually, they turned the department loose. I mean, I have to remember that. I have to remember that. I have to remember Greg Casar. Oh my gosh, that man is amazing. I have to remember Larissa Davila, another, young person that'll just do magic. That's what I have to remind myself every single day, that that having 56 years of experience doesn't make you the goddess of anything.
Well, I think that's a very powerful message. We all have to realize that part of our role in, I'll use the word leadership, is to give other people the opportunities to help change the world as well. So I've got a ton more questions, but we've got an audience, and I assume they've got a few questions. And so I'm going to open up to the audience. If you would turn your cameras on if you want. And we're open for questions either through the chat box, or you can just raise your hand and ask away. Okay, do we have anything out there?
Hi, I'll ask a question. Hello, my name is Janelle Blank, and hi. I was really thankful that Kate had sent out the email about this, because I'm to the point in my life, and I'm in my early 40s, and even though I'm Mexicana in the sense that I'm a descendant, because my great grandfather migrated in the 1800s, and we've researched that on both sides of the family. And my maiden name's Peña, and my mom's maiden name's Ortiz. But because I was raised in an all-white school in an all-white town, and because my parents, because of the discrimination, did not teach me Spanish. So I'm really good at saying, yo no hablo español, and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
What advice do you have outside of reading? Because like now I've looked you up, I've ordered your books, they'll be here on Saturday, and I'm going to be reading. But what other advice do you have for young Latinas who want to know more about our culture, but we're losing it with every generation that we're here?
I forgot to unplug my phone. I'm so sorry. I I just say read, 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 and read. And there's so amazing, amazing works, really good works. And I didn't bring down one, but there's the Chicana Feminist Thought. You can see how I put the papers. Chicana Feminist Thought that has wonderful essays. Chicana, and they're all history of feminism, Chicana feminism. Chicana Movidas that has essays about Chicanas in the women's movement. And I have a long essay in there. There's Chicana Power. You know, this is an excellent, also women in the movement. This is particularly about women in the Chicano movement and has a lot of history. You told me to recommend some books. One of the general books that's pretty good. There's quite a few Manuel Gonzalez Mexicanos in the U.S. And I don't like Rudy Acuna a whole lot because he can be very sexist, has been. But his book Occupied America was one of the first texts that gives you a whole range of the history. If I'm not mistaken, it goes back to colonial times and mostly history of a resistance movement. The other thing that we're working on is we're working on ethnic studies requirement for high school graduation in Texas. You know, they give us a little bit and then we take a whole lot. So we just got approval for ethnic studies courses last year. I worked on that project. And now we're saying, let's make it a high school requirement because I think that ethnic studies and Mexican American emphasis or others is a really great way for everybody in the community to get curious about their own history. So whenever I was isolated from resources and I wanted to get myself you know, into that informed sphere, I would just read. I would read. When I was 4, I learned to read and they wouldn't let me read anything but the Bible. And let me tell you, I got a lot of education reading the Bible, a lot, much more than anybody would recommend for a 4-year-old. I don't know how to cut that off.
No, why don't we just ignore it? Don't worry about it.
You know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna turn my phone off. Sorry. Okay.
So
Thank you. I appreciate the answer.
I wanted to make a comment. So I didn't have the last. I'm half and half. Okay, half Hispanic and half Anglo, as my mother would have put it. But my name is 100% gringa. And one of and I lived in the Valley and I've lived in the Midwest. And I think, and I grew up with don't speak Spanish with my mother, although with my grandparents, that's all I heard in the house. And I know what I did. I pushed that limit because I was always put in a box, no matter where I was, whether I was down south or up north. So in the Valley, I was the gringa or la bolilla, right? The white girl. And when I went up north and lived in the Midwest, you know, they would see my olive complected skin and they would say, "Oh, you have such lovely olive complexion. What are you?" And I used to think, what the hell do you mean? What am I? But I pushed through with language and all the education beyond reading. So even now, like a lot of us don't have time for reading, but there's a lot of educational material out there if you can't do that. Language was really crucial in bridging that divide. And so, yeah, everything you can do to like immerse yourself in the culture. But I really get that don't speak Spanish thing. But it was a little bit ridiculous. But I get it. In that day and time, it was necessary. I mean, my mother failed kindergarten because she couldn't speak English. So, but I hear you.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I think one of the most frustrating things is when I get told by my elders, you know, you just need to learn Spanish. If you want to learn about your culture, just learn Spanish. I grew up in a Spanish speaking household and yet I still didn't learn Spanish. So, you know, I listen to Tejano music. I know who Vicente Fernandez is. I watch telenovelas, but yet I still don't speak Spanish. But I appreciate you talking about it, Heather, and knowing that there's similar experiences. I know there's a lot of people in my generation where our parents were the transition generation because my grandparents didn't speak English. My parents spoke both. And then I don't speak Spanish and my children don't speak Spanish. So my children struggle because their father is also Anglo, and because the traditions we have are mostly surrounded by food. All the food that I make is Mexican. And so my kids, when their friends would come over and said, "Oh, do you all eat Mexican food every night?" And my kids were like, "This is just food." We didn't really think about it that way. It's just food. It's just what mom makes. So between the food and the traditions and the family and the quinceañeras and the weddings and the funerals is the parts that I've been able to hold on to. So now I'm reaching out, like I talked to Kate, I said, "Oh, everything. I want to hear everything and all the speakers we have at ACC so that I can make sure that I participate." So thank you again.
Are there other questions? Let me just insert that from my own study of ethnic communities, and particularly the Jewish community, there is a phenomenon of the third generation returning to their roots. And the third generation is interested in what the second generation has left behind, or the first generation tried to jettison. So I always keep that in mind as hopeful for my own tradition. And there may be some value, Janelle, for you to think about for your kids, that they will find interest in this and try to return to some of those roots. So
I'd like to say that one positive development now in the Latino community, and I think part of it is due to the gun violence issue and the law enforcement extreme colonization issue of communities of color, is that we are looking, and I have written extensively about the way that we deal with mestizaje, the way that we deal with children that are in mixed marriages, you know. We have always been kind, and I think that we're gaining a better awareness of that. We're dealing better with Afro-Latino heritage and history. We're doing better, you know, with children of mixed heritage, because after all, the majority of the Mexicano community is mestizo. You know, we are the products of a mixed, you know, mixed marriages. And so having that heritage, we definitely should be the most understanding. And I have to say that the majority of our literature is in English. So you do not, you know, I don't think, you know, your soul feels where your soul feels, you know, and those values, I used to tell my daughter, I used to say they're in our genes, and then she'd get very smart and say, "What, Kevin Kline or what?" And I said, "No, they're in our DNA. They really are. If the monarch butterflies can find their way, you know, through the generations, we definitely have these, you know, values of aesthetics and spirituality and community and communitarianism, and you know, not so much given to individualism that is negative. These are values that we have, you know. And so reading, you know, helps you rediscover and identify what you are feeling, because you're definitely feeling them. I used to talk about that all the time. You know, your feelings are actually what drives you in a way, for us, because we don't know our history as well as we should know it. We don't know our heritage as well as we should know it. It's taken away from us. And everything that we're doing is like Gloria Saldúa says, excavando, excavando, excavando. We literally dig into the mounds, you know, of our culture and our families to find, you know, that which we know is already within us, but that we can identify. So yeah, it's a discovery process, and I would go for it. It's a joyful thing to do.
is there any other questions out there? We have a number of people who have made some comments in the chat. I don't want to read them, but I think that some of those comments would be worthy of repeating on camera. So if some of you would like to say some of the things you've said in chat, that would be great.
I'd like to share something with the group. I've known Marta for most of my life. And so one of the things that she said to me early on, as a young woman in my 20s, was, our children are not going to learn our traditions and our culture by osmosis. we have to take the time to teach them the history and the reasons why we have these traditions.
Mhm.
And I really took that to heart. And my daughters have been completely engrossed in learning about their culture and their heritage, not just the Mexicano, but the Espanol and the Native American, because my mother is Native American. And so I am so grateful for that, because it has totally changed the dynamic of our family when I came from a generation where we were being told not to speak English because our parents had been penalized or punished for having spoken Spanish in the schools. And so my parents tried very hard to not teach us Spanish so that we would not suffer the same consequences. I was lucky to have had grandparents that fostered the learning of the language, but I'm the only one of my 4 siblings that learned it. And so thank you, Marta, for that.
And I should mention that Bobby will be my guest in November
Oh,
on the topic of Hispanic women in Austin politics. So
Lord have mercy.
I have to say that my mother was extreme. And she was the other. See, parents have different ways of dealing with it. She was the opposite extreme. She would not let us speak English at home. And so to this day, see what happens with upbringing. After 5, I have a very difficult time speaking English. You know, or weekends. Oh my gosh, don't get me on the weekend. I'm totally on Spanish mode. She wanted to participate in our schooling so badly that she made me read the Brothers Karamazov in Spanish. And you haven't lived until you read Russian literature in Spanish. And she made me read Shakespeare in Spanish so that she could read it with me and we could discuss it. But that was also, at that time, I thought she was nuts. But that was also a very good lesson for me, because my son had problems staying focused. So I would read all 15 of his, government readings with him, so that and high school readings too, so that we could discuss it. So parents have different ways of raising us, but thank God, we survive and we thrive if they're paying attention to our development. And we need to talk about boys. I'm very supportive of the males program, by the way. And I have done a lot of reading on how to raise boys that are not into this patriarchal and damaging and killing masculinist. And so I read in one text something that really pleased me. They said that the males movement should read feminist text, because feminists concentrated on developing positive self-concepts for women, positive self-concepts that would not be destructive of their selves and their individuality. And that young men need to do that in order to discover themselves, as human beings and not as, privileged social beings. And so I hope that in a nonprofit that we just formed, Larissa and I can be looking at working with young Latino males.
any other questions? So Martha, is there anything that we haven't asked you that you'd like to share?
Yeah, you were gonna ask me what am I doing? I'm doing everything.
You're causing good trouble.
I know. we and Bobby knows this road we've traveled. We decided decades ago, about 4 decades ago, to work on bettering our institutions serving our community. And so we did that, and we built new institutions. We built a process so that city taxes can go into communities of color, which was not happening, when I first came to Austin and later. And Barry and I spoke yesterday about something that we have kind of neglected to do in the Latino community, and maybe there are other communities that have done that too. I think the community of women also have neglected to do this, and that is to develop nonprofits that are responsive to our needs and that are getting public funds, to work with our specific communities. So we have super huge nonprofits, but then when they get super huge amounts of money, it doesn't really get to the grassroots. And I think that, Barry, I would love it if in the future, your nonprofit organization would host, an informational kind of seminar as to how underserved communities can team up with successful nonprofits to get some of these tax dollars, in the community. During COVID, we discovered that we were sorely lacking in organizations that could reach the grassroots, and therefore a lot of the funds have actually gone unspent. I mean, I just wanted to say that.
Well, I'll commit to bring together you and Bobby, myself and Kate, and we will, as soon as we can, sit down, start planning on that and do something. I think it's a big need. So we'll do it. And now I'm on tape. I'm stuck doing it now.
I have one more question.
Yeah,
actually.
go ahead, Janelle.
It's for Kate, kind of. Kate, would it be possible for all of the books that Martha had recommended earlier, if we could get that sent to us, the list of the books? Because I wrote down most of them, but just in case I missed any, because I am an avid reader.
Absolutely.
Martha, do you have a bibliography that you could send us?
I really don't, but I will be very happy to send you what I consider some of the more basic texts.
That'd be
There's
great.
an amazing book, but it is really, really tough reading. I mean, it's really one of those long scholarly things. It's Raúl Coronado's A World Not to Come. And that book encompasses everything that I studied for 50 years to get to the understanding of our political essence. And instead of hating him, I love him. I adore him. It took him 10 years to write. And he's a scholar. I think he's now at Harvard, but he was a Stanford scholar at the time, a very good friend of my daughter's, and I really adore him. And it's A World Not to Come, and I will send that in. And it's actually Texas based, but it's very important because it tells you why it is that we are different from the Anglo political identity. Why our political identity is communal, and why, we have these issues with contrasting politics and policies and the way that we approach politics, because, he says we come, not from the Luther Reformation tradition that helped develop our political identities in the US, but we come from the Thomas Scholastic tradition that is a different approach to dealing with authority, with political representation. And it is really amazing. And I studied that book because I'm working on a process of getting us into successful strategies for developing citizenship identities. If you look cultural citizenship, if you look at the African-American community, they use their cultural institutions as vehicles as to strategize political movement and political power. And other communities of color need to use their cultural, I think, their own cultural institutions as they identify them in strategic ways, to help propel them into the citizenship, into gaining full citizenship. So that book for Latinos, it is extremely important to understand. It's an intellectual history, but it also gets to the point to where we can understand our values as a mixture of two communities. I wish I had done more with the indigenous. And someday we can talk about the indigenous community. But one of the reasons why women didn't get the vote in Mexico and women were so marginalized in Mexico, including my grandmother, my mother, myself, is because when they developed the Constitution in Mexico, they went to European sources of information, European political philosophies, and not indigenous, which were communitarian, they were more along the scholastic Thomas lines than they were on the Puritan reformist lines. They were more communitarian, they were more equitable, they were more equality-based, recognizing full human beings for everybody, etc. So that book is an excellent one, and I'll add it to the list.
Have you read, or would you recommend, because I just got this book this week and I haven't started it. It's called No Mexicans, Women, or Dogs Allowed. My
Oh,
grandmother actually told me when I was little, she said, Mija, you have to realize that when I was here, when there were signs in Houston, Texas that would say no Mexicans, no dogs. We couldn't go in the restaurants. We couldn't ride the bus, Mija. You don't know what you've lost. You don't know what we fought for. And so then I found this book called No Mexicans, No Women, No Dogs. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's what my grandmother was talking about. So I haven't started reading it yet, but I just got it.
Yeah, well, Cynthia, just for background information, is the sister of Sylvia Orozco, who runs Mexicana Museum.
Yes.
And they're an amazing set of sisters. They're like super sisters, like the Tierra Girls. And that is an excellent, excellent, excellent book. You know, when I was in high school, we traveled to Midland, Texas, and other places in that part of the state, and we could not get food. We could not. Our Anglo teachers had to go and buy stuff, you know, at McDonald's, just like como se llama, Woody Allen did in Bananas. You know, go order like 10 million hamburgers for us. We could not get served. Let me tell you, things like this really politicize people. I mean, really politicize people. Thank you for sharing that.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. But we will include on the webpage and send it out to everybody who's on this call, whatever books Martha sends us. And I would just pick up that in March, we will be focusing on the indigenous Native American folks. And hopefully we'll have you back to speak in that context. So to bring this session to a close, I just want to say what a joy it's been having this conversation. Your wisdom, your authenticity, your warmth are just absolutely amazing. And I've really enjoyed this, and I hope everybody else has as well.
Thank you for coming.
In terms of closing, I want to thank you all for watching and participating in this program, Civil Society. I want to thank Kate, our managing producer and coordinator at the Center for Nonprofit Studies, for her support. If you want to read more about Martha, and as I said, the bibliography, it will be up on our website, Nonprofit Austin /Civil Society. I wish you all a good day. And again, thank you very, very much for the light you brought to us today. And I look forward to seeing all you next Thursday at our next Civil Society.